Hi, my name is Kate, and if you're watching this webinar, then you're probably working with students who are preparing for their Cambridge English exam. Most of the examples I will be using today are based on the B2 and C1 level exams. However, if you're working with the other levels, things I will be talking about are relevant as well. Because the topic for our today's session is using formative assessment to boost exam writing. And let's start by looking at the topics we will be covering in this session. So we're going to start by defining formative assessment, looking into what it is. And I think it's also important to talk about the difference between formative and summative assessment. We're also going to look into a traditional sequence for a writing lesson, and I'm going to make a few suggestions on how to make our writing lessons more effective and more engaging for our students. Later on, I'm going to share a couple of ideas, practical techniques on how to implement formative assessment in your writing lessons. And finally, I'm going to share some links to the useful resources which you can look at later if you're interested in the topic and would like more ideas. So, what is formative assessment and why are we talking about it today? Formative assessment is generally any task or any kind of activity which creates feedback or feed forward for students to inform them about their learning. And formative assessment does not carry a grade, which can be used in summative judgment. So, for instance, if you are assessing your student's piece of writing and you say that the writing can get a grade A, that would be a summative assessment. Whereas if you're giving feedback and telling students, your student, how they did in terms of the grammar, vocabulary, and the other things, and what they should do in order to improve, that would be formative assessment. And let's look into the differences between those two types of assessment, because in a lot of traditional classrooms, summative assessment is quite dominant because we tend to give grades and we tend to tell students how well they did on a specific task. And in a lot of cases, summative assessment happens at the end of the course. It's kind of a summary of what the students have learned, whereas formative assessment is always ongoing and it happens during the course. That's because the idea of formative assessment is to monitor the learning process so that after a couple of lessons, we can see how the students have learned or retained the material, and we can probably adjust our teaching later. Whereas summative assessment is used to evaluate the learner's achievements. If you think about it, if you have students who are learning on a course and they need to kind of graduate, in order to graduate, they need to achieve a grade. That would be one of the cases when summative assessment would be used. So the key purpose for summative assessment is to summarize, is to measure the level of students' proficiency, their achievement at the end of something. Whereas with formative assessment, we, as instructors, we look into how effective our teaching has been and how we can and we need to adapt our further teaching in order to make sure our students benefit. And so in this in formative assessment, feedback is usually quite descriptive and it's qualitative. We're describing the strengths, the weaknesses, we'll be suggesting things which would help students improve in their weak areas. Whereas in the summative assessment, feedback is quantitative. So there is a grade or a score which says this is where you are at the moment, but it does not tell the students what they need to do in order to progress. So essentially, those two types of assessment are quite different, whereas they're both used, they should be used in any language classroom. So if we look at a typical sequence for a writing lesson, what happens there and what kind of assessment do we have? In the most basic writing lesson, we would start by setting the context for the lesson and talking about the topic. Let's say we're working with a story about something that has happened to students recently. And traditionally, students would look at an example, a modal text, and there would be a gist task, as in something. Students would read the text and decide if this is something that has happened to them or not. And because we have an example, a modal text, very often we would use this text to look into different features of this type of the text. We would start by looking at something a bit more general, like the content or the structure or what ideas are mentioned in the text and how they're sequenced. And then we would probably look into different features, linguistic features such as grammar, vocabulary, linking, words, and some functional language. We would then give our students a writing task that could include planning, brainstorming. Students would complete the writing task. They would actually sit down and write. And a writing lesson would end with some feedback. Ideally, if we have the time, we would collect the students' writing and look at it and probably talk about the common features, common mistakes. I know that in a lot of cases, we don't have the time for the actual writing and feedback, and very often that is given for homework, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. If the students can sit down and spend the time working on their piece of writing at home, that's also quite useful. However, in this type of a writing lesson, students usually submit their writing and they get our feedback. So they submit the writing, we grade it, they get their writing back, but there's rarely any kind of work done later. There's rarely any improvement made to this writing. So if we want to help our students perform better, one thing we could and should do is add a stage. So the beginning of the lesson would be the same. We would set the context and we would show students an example, a modal text, and we would look at this text and analyze it in terms of the content, the ideas that are included there and how they are sequenced probably. And we would also look at some of the language there. And having done this, we would give our students the task and some time to produce a draft. It's important because at this stage, students would know that they will get feedback and they will have a chance to improve their writing later. It kind of helps reduce the stress, and it helps students understand that they will need to do something with their writing again later. So once they've drafted it, there is some feedback, and it can come from the teacher, though if we adopt the formative assessment of writing, in a lot of cases, feedback would come from the peers, and we would also get the students to assess their own writing themselves. And after some feedback, students would have to work on the same piece again. They would have to take this feedback into account, and they would have to improve their initial product. And the things we're going to be talking about today will mostly deal with this feedback part, because there are different ways of doing that, and there are different aspects we need to take into account. And I'm going to share a couple of practical techniques for this. So what is feedback? And when preparing for this webinar, I did a little bit of research, and interestingly, I discovered that the word actually comes from physics. And it was first used in the 17th century by a Dutch engineer who produced a thermostat which used mercury. So when the temperature rose in the thermostat, the level of mercury rose as well. And while this was happening, if the level rose to the appropriate level, it triggered the reduction of the production of heat. So it's all about physics, but it's a little bit like this loop where the heat is being produced, the temperature rises, and hence the level of mercury in a thermostat rises as well. And when it hits the level, it says, okay, thanks, no more heat needed, that's fine. Let's stop there. So it kind of triggers the next action. And since then, this word has been used in a lot of different areas. And the way it works in learning and teaching is quite similar, because we see as a result of our actions, and those results usually inform our future actions. So if we look at teaching more specifically, feedback is usually about 3 questions. And the questions are, where am I going? How am I going? And where to next? And in the traditional classroom, the teachers are mainly interested in the first 2 questions. Where am I going? And if we think about exam writing, so I'm learning to write an essay, for example, and how am I going includes both the question about the quality and the approach or the techniques used. So how am I going? Am I doing okay? Am I doing the right things or not? And also, how am I going? That is to say, if I'm writing an essay, am I using the language that is formal enough? Am I using the right vocabulary? Is my structure okay? And that's what the teachers are looking at when doing assessment of a piece of writing. Whereas if we look at it from our students' perspective, they're mainly interested in where to next. As in, as a student, I've produced this, and of course I want to know whether I am doing well, but I also know what else I can do, what else I should do, so that my writing can get the grade I would like to get on my exam. And John Hattie, who is a famous researcher who studied different aspects of teaching, says that feedback to the teacher actually matters more than the feedback to the students. And if we stop there and think about it, it's actually quite interesting, because as teachers, yes, we do tell the students that they have done something well, they have used the correct grammar or a range of lexis, but we're basically telling them where they are at this point. Whereas if we get feedback from our students, we discover what it is that they need, what it is that they would like to learn or to get in order to perform better. So essentially, feedback is a two-way street, and both parties get some. And if we think about formative assessment, it's more about the feedback to the teacher, so that the teacher works on their own teaching. And so what happens is, if at the stage of feedback, students assess themselves or students assess their peers, as teachers, we can kind of look at it from a different angle. We see what the students are actually paying attention to, what they notice in each other's writing. And that's a powerful tool to show us some of the blind spots. And very often students are more willing to produce a final piece of writing in which they work on the things they have identified themselves or their peers have helped them with, especially if they know that this final production will then be followed by some feedback from the teacher. And here we can, of course, provide them with summative feedback or tell them how they did. Though I personally think that it's always great to tell our students what else they can do and how they can improve their writing skills. So formative assessment of writing is really important because it helps with a lot of different aspects. It helps the students to understand their own errors, and it helps them learn from them. And they can see those things for themselves. It also promotes active learning, because very often students produce a piece of writing and they wait for us to grade their writing. However, if they start looking at their own piece themselves, they become more active, and they actually start thinking about their writing even before they get to it. The other thing is it allows for more personalized work, because when we do formative feedback, we're focusing on a student's individual piece of writing. And of course, we would see where they are in terms of the benchmark, but we would also see what this specific student needs to work on. And it's also quite motivating, because if we do formative feedback, if we provide students with formative feedback throughout the whole course, students see their progress over time. They can go back to their initial pieces of writing and they can see what they did there, and then look at their the pieces of writing that they produced later on in the course, and they will see how much they have learned. But how does this happen? What things are there for us which help us achieve all this? And I'm going to talk about a couple of practical tools which are all part of formative assessment of writing. And the first thing to think about is setting clear goals for what the students need to work on. And very important, looking beyond grammar and vocabulary. Let's have a look at very standard writing prompt for B2 first writing part. And I took this writing prompt from one of the course books I like for exam preparation that's ready for B2. And so this writing prompt asks our students to write an essay, and it's always the same type of thing. Students have a topic and they have some context, and they have to write an essay and include and use all notes and include reasons and examples for their point of view. If we look at this prompt, it's very clear that when assessing the student's piece of writing, we will need to make sure that they have included all the notes, that they have given reasons, and we'll also look at their grammar and vocabulary. Very often, those are the most straightforward things to look at. However, when working with exam preparation, we always look at the official criteria suggested by those who produce those exams. And for B2 First and C1 Advanced, there are 4 main areas that are being assessed. And as you can see, they go way beyond grammar and vocabulary and include content, communicative achievement, organization, and language. And grammar and vocabulary are important, of course, and we will be looking at both their accuracy and range of the grammar and vocabulary. However, we're also interested in whether the student has actually done what they're asked to do, or if they're kind of talking about the topic but are not exactly there. We will also be assessing the communicative achievement, and that is to say how appropriate the writing is for the task, whether the register is right, whether it's formal enough, and also what impact this writing produces on the reader, which sounds a bit subjective, but there are ways to look at it. And we will also be looking at organization or whether the students have actually included the relevant ideas and linked them together in a logical way. So as we can see, there's quite a lot for us to assess. And if we look at B2 more specifically, we can go to the official Cambridge website and get the official criteria there. So the biggest number of points the students can get for content, for instance, is 5. And they get a 5 if all content is relevant to the task and the target reader is fully informed. If there are minor irrelevances, if there are omissions, and if there isn't enough information, that's a 3, and somewhere in between, that's a 4. Those who actually assess the exam writing, they have more detailed scales, and this is just to give us an idea of what we should expect from our students. However, this is a very helpful guiding tool for us to help our students prepare for what they actually need to do. So, for instance, the difference between a 5 and a 3, all content is relevant and minor irrelevances or omissions are present. If we look back at the task, the modern domestic appliances which improve the quality of our lives. We need to talk about the effect on household chores, time saved for other activities, and our own idea. If we cover all 3, that would most probably be a 5, whereas if we omit our own idea, the grade will be lower because there is an omission, as you can see. And when assessing our students' writing, what we really want to do is say, in this essay, you have covered all 3 points, keep up the good work or keep doing things like this. And if we see that our students have omitted their own idea, we would specifically state that you have covered the first and the second point, but you did not include your own idea. In your next essay, make sure that you cover all 3 points in order to achieve a higher grade. And if we want to be really, really helpful, we would say that one of the examples could include, in our case, probably the how effectively we can complete the tasks that we need to do, how well we can do the household chores. So, for example, if we use a broom to swipe the floor or And if we use a vacuum cleaner, the quality of the cleaning would be different. That's included in the effect of household chores. And in addition to this, we could say that we were probably becoming more advanced with technology in general, and therefore developing our own skills which are transferable to the other areas. I'm, of course, talking about something that's not very common, but that's just to give you an idea of a suggestion we could make. And when we go beyond saying this is good, and when we say this is what else you need to do, this is an example for you, that's an example of formative feedback. And very often, if you're using a course book in your exam preparation, if you look into the teacher's book, there will be teaching tips to help you see what you actually need to do. And because I mentioned that we need to look beyond grammar and vocabulary, I actually found a very nice piece from the teacher's book for Ready for B2, which says that when assessing exam writing, examiners are rarely hard on errors that are below the level expected. They're rarely hard on the errors that are actually they're rarely hard on the errors that are quite advanced, and they're really picky about the things that impede communication or like really obvious errors. And if our students experiment with the language and try something advanced, examiners will most probably think that it's a good thing. The suggestion here says that we should only focus on the most obvious errors when giving feedback on our students' writing. And what I really, really like about this bit is that they're telling us to focus more on what the students are doing really well. And I think this is one thing we often forget about. Our students really need and they really like to be praised. And when they know what they're doing well, and when they're told that they need to continue doing this, it stays with them and they continue with those things. And the other thing is, I'm sure you've all had students who hate writing and who think it's time-consuming, it's energy-consuming. And one thing that really contributes to this negative feeling towards writing is the fact that very often students submit their writing and then they have to wait for some time and they get feedback and they get a lot of corrections in their piece of writing. So it's quite unpleasant in a lot of ways to see that they have invested the time and effort and that they have made so many mistakes. Depends on the mindset, of course, but experience shows that if we focus on what the students do well, especially at very early stages in the course, students become a lot more motivated and more grateful. The other thing that I really like about teachers' books is that we can find examples of good writing and we can actually find comments on those examples. So as you can see, I took this example from the teacher's book, and it's quite nice. And we can also see how the examiner commented on the things that are relevant. So you can see comments on the structure of the writing, which goes way beyond grammar and vocabulary. And the examiner has also commented on the use of style and the use of linking words. As you can see, there's nothing about grammar and vocabulary. Those comments are quite brief and they are given there to guide us as teachers. I think that when giving feedback on our students' writing, we can expand on that and we can state more specifically that, for instance, our students have used the formal style and this is appropriate, and probably give some examples of things which are related to the formal style. So once we have actually discovered, once we have planned what we're going to work on, and we have decided that this goes beyond grammar and vocabulary, we need to provide our students with something tangible, like a list of the things that they will need to produce as part of their writing. And again, let's look at a writing prompt. It also comes from the same course book, Ready for B2. And this time, as you can see, I took it from the workbook. And this is a writing prompt for an article. So in this case, students see an announcement, and they would have to write. They would have to write an article about the changes that will have a positive effect on their life. And in order for us to produce a list of things that would be included in successful writing, we would probably use brainstorming, in which we would ask our students to think about an article that they have read recently. It does not have to be about this topic. It could be a similar type of article. And we would ask them to think about the things that they saw there. And preparing for this webinar, I actually looked at a couple of articles and also looked into the teacher's book. And so this is what the teacher's book is suggesting. It's a title, asking questions, using idioms and other examples of semi-formal language. Having one paragraph for one idea to have a more positive effect on the reader, and things like that. So there's several approaches to this. We could ask our students to think of an article they have read and try and recall those things. We could also give them an example and ask them to look at it and identify the things that would be common. The key thing here is to produce an actual checklist, to write it on the board if you're in a face-to-face classroom, or on the screen if you're teaching online. And students would have to keep it. They would have to take a screenshot, a photo, or we would probably photocopy this list, because this is something that stays with the student. Checklists are a powerful tool because they go through the whole writing lesson. We produce them at the stage of brainstorming or looking at a model, and we go on with those checklists. We use them for self and peer assessment. So this is the same checklist for the same task that we looked at a moment ago, an article which talks about life changes. And as you can see on the left, this is the checklist that we produce at the stage of brainstorming. And on the right, this is a checklist that we would produce if we're looking at an example. And I actually took this from the book. So it can be formulated differently, but the idea would be the same. The task says tick the techniques that the writer uses in the example. I would also ask the students to look at this example, underline the techniques, and probably write the number of the corresponding technique next to the examples underlined. And once again, I will keep saying that let's not ignore the teacher's book, because very often we think that we're too busy to look there, and we think that we will find the answers. But teachers' books often go beyond giving suggested answers. They also make useful suggestions for our own teaching. So if you have a look at this teaching tip, this one is from the teacher's book for ready for C1, which is a higher level exam. And you will see that the suggestion says that we need to tell the students they need to check off the items on the list when they're actually assessing their own writing. And we should ask the students to hand in their piece of writing along with the checklist where they have marked what they have or haven't done. And as you can see in our previous example, the checklist was formulated as a number of bullet points because we're analyzing the example. And in this case, because this is the checklist used for self-assessment, things are formulated as questions. So don't ignore the teacher's book. The teacher's books often have a lot of useful suggestions on what we can and should do to help our students. We've talked about using checklists when looking at an example and when brainstorming, and also using checklists to assess, for the students to assess their own writing. But the same checklists can be used for peer assessment, and the teachers can also use checklists. They can take the checklist and, tick the things that have been done. There's a couple of things we need to take into account when working with checklists. Working with checklists for peer assessment, but a lot of those are also useful and relevant to self-assessment. So first of all, when doing peer assessment, I think it's very important to emphasize that students should not be giving feedback on the linguistic aspects of writing. They should focus on things such as task achievement, organization, effect on the reader, clarity, whether the ideas are interesting, relevant, whether the structure is good. Because as teachers, we can always look at grammar and vocabulary later, but there's so much more to writing. When we ask students to assess each other's writing, we should always provide them with a checklist to help them focus, to let them know what they should be looking at. And when doing this, I think it's important to limit the number of points students are looking at. If we look back at this teaching tip from the teacher's book, you'll see that there's only 5 questions. In the previous checklist, there's 10, but some of the things are quite minor. So again, it's very important to limit the number of things. And the suggestion here is limit the number of things to 5, because it's very difficult to keep too many things in one's head. And with the help of checklists, students develop the ability to notice how their own writing can be improved. And if, as a student, I get a checklist and I get my partner's writing, I am, of course, reading my partner's writing. I am looking at the checklist, and without even wanting it, I will be thinking about my own writing, thinking, did I actually do that in my own piece? And it kind of raises our own awareness of those blind spots. And the other thing is, I will see something in my partner's writing, something that I haven't done or hadn't thought of. And this is how students get more ideas. So there's so many benefits to peer assessment, as long as peer assessment is guided and uses the checklist. The other important point about checklists is that we have to be consistent. If we're looking at a modal text and if we're producing a checklist there, then the checklist we give for the students as part of the task should include the same points. No new points should come up there. And when we give a checklist for self-assessment or peer assessment, it's also very important that it includes the points that we have covered previously. if we add something new, if we introduce something new without clarifying it, students will get confused. In the example from the teacher's book, we're looking at a self-assessment checklist which says, have I done this? And if we want to use it for peer assessment, we would reformulate it into, has your classmate addressed all the points, included any information, and so on and so on. And the beauty of a comprehensive course and the beauty of a course book is that in Unit 1, for example, you will get a checklist which is used to analyze a modal text. And then in Unit 2, the checklist will be used for self-assessment. But the teaching tip will most probably remind you to produce a checklist as part of planning. And then in Unit 4, for example, you will see a checklist which is used for a different purpose. And you'll get a reminder that the checklist can be used for all those things. So this way, as we go through the course, we get introduced to the different types and purposes of a checklist. My next point, and I think it's very important, is that we should train our students instead of testing them. And I quite like to use this picture to create a mental anchor on this. So what do I mean by training rather than testing? If we give our students writing prompt, and if we simply tell them to do something without showing them an example and without showing them how to do that, there has been very little teaching. And essentially what happens is we are testing what the students can already do. And it's quite possible to use this at the beginning of the course. So if you're just starting with a group of students, you might want to do something like this in one of the first writing lessons. Give them a writing prompt, ask them to write an article, and don't give them too much information. This will be an initial test. However, this piece of writing should most probably be followed by a comprehensive feedback. And I've produced and I'm sharing a prompt for formative feedback, which I know it looks quite big and looks quite time-consuming, but I personally think that this is something that really helps students improve their writing. So if we take one of the criteria, let's take communicative achievement, and that's whether the writer has followed the conventions for this type of writing or this register, and whether it has a positive effect on the reader. We would need to do three things. First, like I said before, we need to praise the students for something they have done well. So we could say that they have followed the conventions for formal register, conventions for an essay, they included full forms rather than contractions, and so on. Remember, it's very important to give examples. We could state, or we should state, things they need to continue working on. And this could include making paragraphs more organized, as in starting a paragraph by introducing the topic and then providing supporting points and examples. And my personal favorite, and I think it's the most important thing, we need to explain how the students can improve this area. So if we say that students need to work on the structure of the paragraph, we could give them an example of a good introductory sentence. The other thing that's very important here is we said earlier that the key purpose of formative feedback is for the teacher to get some feedback on their own teaching so that they can improve their further activities. So when I do something like this, I photocopy or I save the feedback I give to my students. And then I look back at it when planning my next writing lessons, because it's very easy to continue doing a very similar thing, to continue giving students articles to write. But if we look back at the feedback we gave them, and if we see that, for instance, most of the students needed more work on making their articles better, let's say better organized or more persuasive or more engaging, this is probably something that we would need to clarify in our next lesson. And again, if we think about writing lessons, very often we focus on the lexical items used there, the linking words and things like this, because they're very, very obvious. And that's what we are familiar with and used to. Whereas if when assessing a task, we look at the criteria, that's the 4 things we have on the left, and we outline the things that need improvement and how they can be improved, this is something we can look back at when planning our next lesson, and that's something we should base our next lesson on. Because this looks quite big, we don't always have to, and I personally think we should not cover all of those points. And in one lesson, we could choose 2, for instance, and prioritize content and organization. The most important thing is that we should not simply fill all the columns. Like if we simply praise the students for things in every area, that has very little benefit. Whereas if we take content and we state something that they did well, something that they need to continue working on, and something they can do to improve, that will be a lot more beneficial. So work with the rows rather than columns. If sometimes you're looking at a student's writing and you're not very sure whether it's good and you don't have enough ideas on what else can be done and how things can be done, we can always go to the official exam website or to the teacher's book and see some sample answers like the one we're looking at here. And this is quite a good one. And it will most probably be supported by an examiner comment. You will see that the mark is a good pass, and we can also find detailed comments. You can pause this webinar and read the details, look at the details. I've highlighted a couple of things here. So when we look at communicative achievement, the suggestion here says that the opening and closing comments are generally appropriate, although a hug is not usual. It's good to point that out. However, if we want to give formative feedback, I think we should tell our students what they should do in this case. It would be something like, although a hug is not very usual, you could say something like lots of love, because it's an informal email in this case. The other thing is the writing uses a range of linking words, in particular at the beginning of the sentences. However, there is an over-reliance on and to. There is an over-reliance on and to link ideas within sentences. And if we want to give formative feedback, we would go one step further, and we would suggest ways to improve that. If you look at the sample answer, I've highlighted those examples. One of the techniques we could use is we could photocopy this sample answer for the students, and we could ask them to look at this sample answer and decide if there is a good range of linking words. And they would most probably spot the problem with and. And we could ask the students to rewrite this piece, reformulating the sentences with and. this would help them focus on this particular area, and this would provide them with suggestions on how to improve it. And why we're doing this is that there's a very good reason for that. And this reason has been discussed in quite a few books recently, but it was originally introduced by Anders Ericsson, who's a researcher and a scientist, and he looks into learning, and he looks into how people turn into experts. They start as newbies, as novices, and how what it is that they do to turn into experts. And he has discovered that the difference between an average performer, or like somebody who's just started doing something, and an expert lies in 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. And in this case, the key word is deliberate. And he goes on and he explains what deliberate practice is. And it includes 4 main areas. That's guidance and feedback. That is to say, whenever our students are practicing writing, they need to get guidance. If we tell them that it's not very good to use and in all sentences, we should tell our students what else they can do, or we should show them. And we should also provide them with the feedback. If they practice, if they rewrite this piece of writing, we should provide them with feedback on how they performed. Deliberate practice is focused. And this is why I chose the example I was showing you here, because it's quite focused. There aren't too many areas that need improvement. There are only a few, which helps us really focus on those several areas. Constant repetition is another key to success, because we know that the key function of our memory is not actually memorizing; it's actually forgetting. So, in order for us to retain something, we should do this thing again. Like if we want to retain a variety of different linking words which can be used instead of and, we should do activities which help us practice this again and again and again. And in order for us to progress, for our students to progress, we should increase the level of complexity. If the students have mastered also, we should start introducing the other linking words. And an interesting thing is that one of the techniques used in formative feedback is a learning portfolio. So ideally, our students should be saving all the writing that they produce and all the checklists that they use. And, from time to time, they should be going back to the first examples, and they should look at those and see which things they were unaware of at that stage and how they have progressed so far. So, like I said, one of the key things is revision. And I think that with writing, it's very important to keep a revision bank. And you will see that in this example, I removed the thing that was wrong here, that in that red box, if you remember, it was written a hug, which is not very common for this type of writing. If you're working in a face-to-face classroom, you could simply print it out like this and highlight that thing. And, at the beginning of a lesson, you could give your students an envelope with a collection of things like this, and they could look at those and suggest things that should be used here. If we want to work on end, we could have this sentence written on a slip of paper and saved in the same envelope. And, at the beginning of a subsequent lesson, the students would take this sentence, they would look at it, and even without any specific instructions, they would probably recall the context. They would realize that they need to reformulate this using alternatives for end. The other aspect of formative feedback, which is quite important and quite powerful, is using learning logs or learning portfolios, which is something I've already mentioned, and also using the technique of self-reported grades. And this is also something suggested by John Hattie. So John Hattie is an Australian researcher who looked into the different things which have impact on learning. And there are things like homework, feedback, class size, use of technology, use of fun in the lesson. And he studied the effect that those things have on learning, as in if we give homework, does it help our students progress significantly or not very significantly? And he has discovered that the technique called self-reported grades is one of the most powerful tools that we can use to help our students progress. And I'll give you an example, and I'll give you a framework for this. But before that, I just wanted to show you a couple of things that he studied. So as you can see, there are things which have reverse effects and things which don't have any significant effect. And they're in the red, yellow, and the green area. And all the things that are in the blue area are the things that have significant impact on the learner's performance. And you'll notice that feedback is there, and self-reported grades are also there. And you will see this lovely formative teacher evaluation among those. So all the things that we're talking about today are actually some of the most powerful tools to help our students progress better. So let's look back at what self-reported grades are. Let's think about a specific example. Let's think about writing an article. And in our case, we have an article talking about changes that would have a positive effect on our life. So let's imagine that we're starting working on a unit on writing. And at the very beginning, we would introduce the topic to the students. We would say that we're going to work on writing an article for an exam and tell the students what they would need to demonstrate that they can write an article effectively. And at this stage, we could even provide our students with a checklist of things. And if you remember one of the previous slides, we had a catchy title, asking the reader a question, addressing the reader, use of idioms, use of descriptive adjectives. So we could provide our students with the topic, with the task over here, and we could also give them a checklist of the things that they will need to do. Having done this, we would ask our students to predict how well they would be able to do this. So they would simply look at the checklist and would decide, okay, idioms, I know quite a good range of idioms, so I would do well in this. Catchy title, I'm not very imaginative, so 50-50, I'm not very sure. And so before students even start writing, they would predict their own performance. And then we would look at their own assessment and we would set out specific learning goals. We would see what the students are confident in and we would pay less attention to that. And we would pay more attention to what the students already know. While we're working on those things, we would need to provide the students with opportunities to reflect on their progress. For instance, if the students initially think that they're not very creative and they can't come up with a good title, we would work on the titles, and then having completed this stage, we would probably ask them to look back and decide if at this current point they can produce a better title or not. And finally, we would get the students to produce a piece of writing, and we would get them to look at the checklist and their own predictions they made first, and see if their predictions were right, and if they managed to improve in the areas that we were working on, And another interesting question is whether they were actually able to perform well in the areas they thought they would be able to perform well in. And it's a very powerful metacognitive tool, because when we give a set of criteria at the very beginning and we ask the students to decide which things they can already do, we help them decide what they need to invest more time and energy in. And this technique is linked very closely to one more thing, which is also very powerful, but we often forget about it. And I call it assessment as interview, but it's actually something very basic and very simple. And the suggestion is to ask genuine questions if we want to get genuine answers. And it has been discovered that asking questions is one of the key formative assessment strategies to promote learning. Because if we ask our students a genuine and honest question about what they are good at or what they're confident in and what they would like more work in, they would most probably help us identify the things that they need to work on. This principle works in the technique of self-reported grades, but it's a little less obvious here, because we give a checklist and we ask the students to grade the things based on how confident they're in. And we kind of guide them. We give them a number of things to look at. Whereas here, questions are more open-ended. I've included some examples of more genuine questions here. And the reason they're so powerful is because they are designed to elicit the information from the students. As in, when we say, how do you feel about your own piece of writing? Students, we don't know the answer the students would give us. We don't really know how they feel about it. And if we ask them about the difficulties they had, I don't think we know what the answer would be. And as opposed to asking them things like, does your writing include enough descriptive adjectives? Does your writing include enough idioms? Those questions are a bit more factual. And if we think about that, as teachers, we can take their writing, we can look at it and decide whether the writing contains enough idioms. So, essentially, what's the point of asking the student this question? If we ask them about their feelings and their impressions and the struggles they had, this is where we get more information. The other question I quite like is why. It can be a bit stressful, because when we ask why, we can kind of sound as if we're questioning the relevance of this. And I often like to reformulate this question into, can you tell me more about this? And the other thing I think we should do is ask students what they would like to get more feedback on. Finally, let's always remember the key purpose of formative assessment. And the purpose of formative assessment is to help us adjust our further teaching, is to help us decide what we need to revise and what we need to work on in our next lessons. So our work with a specific piece of writing does not stop when we've given feedback to the students. We take it and we use those findings to plan our next lessons, our subsequent lessons. And if we can do that, if we can plan our courses to make sure that we dedicate the time to this, our students definitely benefit more, because this way we are following a course, and in a lot of ways we're following a course book, but we're adjusting our teaching to the students' needs. And what can be more powerful than that? When preparing for this webinar, I was looking for some inspiration, and I came across a lovely TED Talk given by Bill Gates, in which he says that feedback is quite important in our lives. And unfortunately, there's one group of people where they get almost no systematic feedback to help them do their jobs better. And actually, those are the people who have one of the most important jobs in the world, and that's teachers. And that's true. Very often it's difficult for us as teachers to get feedback because being observed is stressful, and it often requires some time and effort from the other people. And it's the most obvious to get feedback, to invite somebody to observe our lesson and give us feedback. So if we create a dialogue with our students, if we can use questions with our students, ask them what they would like to work on, what they would like to get more feedback on. That's one of the powerful tools for us as teachers to get feedback on what we're doing. If we use learning portfolios, if students save their own writing from the first one and throughout the course, as teachers, we can go back to their first writing, second writing, third writing, and we can see how they have progressed. And that's also feedback for us, because we see that if they have retained this, then most probably there was something we did right. And we can also spot the recurring problems or the things that are still missing, and inform our further teaching as well. I'm almost done with this session, and while I'm finishing here, I'd just like to summarize the key ideas I mentioned, the key principles and the key techniques used in formative assessment of writing. And first of all, that's setting out clear goals and establishing that we're working beyond grammar and vocabulary, that we're going to clarify things other than those two, and we're going to assess things that go beyond grammar and vocabulary. One of the key techniques is checklists, and we should generate checklists while we're looking at examples, modal texts, or brainstorming ideas for a specific type of writing. And we should use the same checklists for self-assessment and for peer assessment. And if we're doing that, we should make sure that the checklists are consistent, or that the other things do not appear suddenly in the middle of a lesson. We should always go to the teacher's book if we need more ideas or if we're looking for teaching tips. There are lots and lots of great things there, so we should always look for ideas in the teacher's books. We should train our students. We can test sometimes. However, any kind of test should be followed by feedback with suggestions on how to improve. And because one of the keys to success is deliberate practice, and one of the aspects of deliberate practice is constant revision, focused revision, I think that we should create revision banks, little slips with the things that we have worked on, alternatives for and, correct opening remarks, correct endings for different types of letters, ideas on how to structure the writing, and so on. Using learning logs and self-reported grades, using learning logs to help students get more motivated when they look back at their first writing and they see how much they have progressed. And for us to get feedback on how we have been doing as teachers, if we look at the first writing and if we look at the subsequent writing pieces, we can see what's still missing and what we need to work on. and self-reported grades, getting the students to predict how they will perform. And I also think that it's important to ask genuine questions, real questions, questions about how students feel. And finally, we should always remember to use our findings to inform our further teaching, because this is the whole idea behind formative assessment. We're not doing that to decide where the students are. We're doing that to decide what else we need to do in our lessons. And like I promised, I'm giving you a list of references. They're some of the books that I used in this research, and also a couple of links to different websites. And I'll be finishing my session here. Thank you very much if you've managed to listen through the whole session. And if you're here, I really appreciate your time and attention. And I hope that you can use at least some of those ideas. And I really hope that they will help your students become much better writers and have fun in your writing lessons. Thank you.